828 and this is Crossbeats production. So in this video I want to show you guys when EQ is used and how I find I should use EQ, and when I should use it, when I shouldn't use it, and that kind of thing. EQ is very difficult to understand when you first start out and you first start mixing your own stuff. And really, in essence, the only reason why I think it's difficult to understand is because it's difficult to know when to take away things and when to add things. And especially not understanding the spectral meter and understanding where certain instruments sit within that spectral meter. Now, when I EQ certain things, I know when I first started out, I used to struggle so much in understanding where I should put a high pass filter, where I shouldn't put one in, and so on and so forth. And when it came down to it, after a long while and understanding where instruments sat within the spectral meter, that's when I started to really understand when I should put an additive EQ or when I should reduce or do reductive EQ. For the most part, in most of my mixing, I do reductive EQ. I don't generally do a whole lot of additive EQ unless it's exactly necessary for the instrument I'm using it on, or I feel like I need a bit more low end or whatever it might be. But generally, it's more in creative or sculpting things where you do additive EQ. You do sculpting with reductive EQ as well, but there's certain things that you just really don't need to keep doing additive EQ on. I find a lot of people when they do a lot of additive EQ, you hear that their mixes are very harsh and there's a lot of top end frequencies that just don't sound right to the ear. And that's come about more in the digital realm than it has in the analog. But in this tutorial, I want to show you guys what I did with this mix and the minimal kind of stuff that I have done and how good it sounds just in doing all that. So first off, I'll show you the track. I'll show you a section of the track. It's not the typical kind of thing you'd hear on my channel, but I made this beat a couple of nights ago, and I felt like it was really handy to show you guys and give you an understanding and a backstory behind the EQ as well. So let me just play you this section of the track and you guys can hear that, and then I'll explain some EQ moves to you in just a minute. Okay, so pretty much the track is as you hear it. It's almost fully mixed and I'm pretty much doing the mastering on it now. But as it was, the mix was really good. It came up really good and instruments sat well in the mix and things like that. So how I achieved that, first off, I'll show you a few hacks that I kind of do and explain to you how they work and things like that. So the first hack that I do before I do EQ or anything on the track is I put this into mono. So you can set this thing here and you can change that to either stereo or mono. That's a little function there. Or I use the UAD function which comes on the console and I can switch it from mono or stereo there if I want to. Generally I use this one because it feels right for me and the sound of it works well. And I can also meter it on that UAD console as well. So it's got a meter there, so basically it allows me to see it. Otherwise, I mean, if you're doing it just in Studio One, you don't have UAD, then that works perfectly okay. Don't think that it doesn't, because it does. It works fine. And you can just switch that straight to mono, and then you can do everything in mono in regards to mixing and doing that sort of stuff. Obviously, it's just a cross-check. You don't leave it in mono through the whole entire process if you don't want to. It's just a cross-check, so you can check it in mono, you check it in stereo, switch it about, see what you're hearing within both the spectral meters and the stereo field as well. So that's my little hack that I always usually use when I mix my tracks. And even when I master stuff, sometimes I just flick it to mono just so I can hear things in mono and my room doesn't interfere with me then, and I can hear all the instruments a bit clearer. Another thing you'll notice as well is there's a slight volume increase when it's in mono because everything's being forced into the center spectral meter, or central spectral field there, I should say. and that sort of increases a little bit in the volume, especially when I use my UAD version of the flick to mono. But that's the first kind of hack that I use, and people will agree with this, people will disagree. It doesn't really bother me if you disagree, because you can do it however you want to, that's fine. So anyway, so getting to EQ, and I'll just show you some EQ things that I've done here to set the EQ up. And also, I'll explain to you prior to the EQ what I did to first set up some structure within the dynamic range of the mix. So if you're aware, obviously drums are kind of a very dynamic instrument within a mix generally for any mix, and the reason why drums are dynamic is because it has a lot of low end and it has high end frequencies as well. And usually drummers will hit a certain way, and they'll hit a certain way when they want to get more emphasis out of that kick or a snare or whatever it might be. So when I set up my drums, I put a limiter on my drums, usually pretty early on in the mix, to get some sort of dynamic control in the mix. The drums were the second feature to this track. So first off, I had the guitar. So this is the guitar here. Okay, so I had that guitar, and then I started working off that guitar to make the rest of this beat. So that was my first instrumental part that I added to this. Some people add drums, some people have instruments, whatever it might be for yours. Anyway, that's off the topic on this, because this is about EQ, and I want to show you guys what I did with my EQ moves. First off, to give you an idea of this whole entire mix. And I'm going to make separate videos and explain the compression techniques that I used on this as well. And I also use some tape emulation and things like that. But more or less, I wanted to show you some stuff that you guys can do within Studio One with the standard EQs that you don't have to have these specific EQs to do. Because a lot of the moves require basically the standard kind of EQ that you can get from any DAW. So it's not applicable just to Studio One, but this works in Studio One, obviously. So first off, the EQ that I used was an Izotope EQ, which I use as the mastering EQ as well. It's set to stereo, so if you have the stock EQ within Studio One, you can use the exact same moves that I've done here. So the EQ that I used on the guitar, I'll just play it with the EQ and then without it. So with the EQ first. And then I'll bypass it now as well. I'll add it back on. Okay. So if you guys were listening to a couple of things there, mainly what I was paying attention to was the real harsh top end stuff that's in that guitar, and that's because of the distortion and stuff like that on the guitar. It wasn't a bad thing at all. It sounds fantastic. Even on its own, it sounded good without the EQ, and I'm not saying it didn't. It's just that it needs certain things within the mix to make them all sit together. Now, when I set this whole entire mix up, I didn't do any EQ until I got all of the instruments sitting in there, and then I realized there was some things that were interfering with other things. So I needed to do reductive EQ to get this out of the way of other instruments. Mainly the drums, because when you hear the drums set up in just a second, you're going to notice that there was certain EQ things that just needed to be done on the drums as well. These two Neutron plugins, I'm going to explain them in a second, because they're also doing EQ moves, and they're vital for you to know because they also fall part of this track. So let me play the drums with the guitar now. Okay, as you can hear, they sit really well together, and I just showed you this because I want to show you kind of the behind the drums, what I actually did to make these drums. So what I used was the 80s Abbey Road 80s drummer there, and it comes in with its own console. So I mean, that's why you can only see it in one sort of setup there. It's just in one one channel, because I can actually control where the pan and things like that and the actual volumes within this actual plugin. So it's kind of cool that you can do that, because you don't have to go, you know, bust out everything and track out everything. You can just leave it in that plugin. So that's a drummer thing that I use there. So if you want to know how I created these drums, that's how I did it. And they sound actually really good, because it sounds almost like a real drummer is actually playing the drums rather than just some crazy, you know, I don't know, some crazy stuff that you might hear out of plugins that you can get. So anyway, EQ moves, right. So what I did here, I'll show you the EQ that I've used on the drums, and I'll just pin that to the screen there. This is another EQ, so we'll just pin that as well. And then the EQ for the piano is on the left. So all of the EQ for piano is on the left, all of the EQ for the drums is on the right. So you guys can see exactly what I've done here to make these fit in and sit in the mix. Alright, so basically, you know, how does someone come to these moves, and how would you know to do certain things like this on the drums or the guitar or any instrument for that matter? How would you find this out? So first off, the moves that I did with my EQ, as you can see on the low end spectrum on both of these EQs, I've got low end stuff removed. So from the band 1, there's pretty much 24.9. From band 1 on this, it's 23.8. Kind of close. Didn't really have to be perfect. I could have used exactly the same settings really if I wanted to. But for the most part, these frequencies here are something that I didn't need on either of these instruments. If you're looking at them as an instrument separately or together, I didn't need them on both of those. I mean, you could use an EQ on your bus and remove this out as well if you want to. But I felt for the sake of cleanness in the mix that I should remove it out early on in the mix and get rid of it. And keep in mind, this is well after I've created the track and then I'm doing the mixing phase. So whilst I'm creating the track, for the most part, I didn't do a whole lot of EQing, but it kind of started it really started when I got real close to the end of the creation of the track, and then I was doing tweaks and stuff. That's when I started mixing it. It's not wrong to do it the other way around. You know, if you're creating a track and some parts of the track you're mixing it throughout the track, that's also perfect. But I feel like sometimes if you get too caught in mixing whilst you're creating the track, you kind of get lost in that, and your creative juices or creative flow starts to come to a halt because you're too busy trying to work around frequencies and stuff like that. So I feel like when you EQ after it and you've created your track and everything's all there, then you can kind of start working around that. And even with the, I guess, placement of instruments, that could even come about at that point as well. But anyway, let me just explain a few things here. So obviously, like I was saying, the low end stuff I removed out, and that was on both of the instruments there. So next thing was top end frequencies. Now with the guitar, obviously it was a decision between where I wanted things to sit in the mix. So I removed some of that real high end stuff out of the guitar because I didn't need it. And it still left the guitar sounding really, really good and clean. And also I left some of the high end stuff that was kind of up to about, where have we got here? Band. So 11 kilohertz that I've pretty much taken out everything above that, and it's on a slope of 12. So it does leave a little bit at this really high end stuff here, but it does reduce the frequency a bit. And then the next moves for both of these instruments. So if you're just looking at on the left, this is the piano here. I've used quite an intensive kind of setup here with Neutron, and I must say that Ozone and Neutron, or actually any of the Izotope plugins, are fantastic for mixing. So if you guys are looking for some third-party stuff to do mixing with or mastering, these just work really well. But like I said, you can still use the standard plugins, except for the fact that Izotope Neutron has a dynamic EQ that doesn't have that in Studio One. But if you're just looking for standard EQs, you can use those out of Studio One. So a free dynamic EQ, by the way, if you're looking for a free one, there's a plugin that is called, where is it? Tokyo Dawn. So dynamic EQ, they make a TDR Nova, which is a dynamic EQ. It has a compressor in there as well. So if you're looking for something as an alternative, a free alternative that you can use similar to what I'm doing here, that's one of your options that you got. So next EQ with the piano, with some reductive EQ at the top end stuff. So you've got 7.2 kilohertz and 1.9, almost 2K. And then I've got a dynamic EQ down at 84 and a shelf that removes some at 100 and below. So that's the piano. And then I've got all these little crazy little things close together that are removing some of the top end frequencies out of the drums there. So if I just show you this, so I've got a filter, well, a low cut at 6.4, sorry. What's this one? 4. Yep, 4.8, and then I've got another one here at 3.5. So all of those are kind of around the same sort of area, but the reason why I removed it out of here is because I plan to have vocals sitting in this kind of space, and also this kind of space as well. Now, how I came to the conclusion as well was by using the masking meter within within Neutron. So if you set up a masking meter within Neutron, if you have Neutron, you can follow kind of how I've done this, but I'll just quickly play the whole instruments to you and show you where it's masking. So pay attention up here along this meter here, and also pay attention to this meter here. It will show you some masking on that as well. I'll just quickly play it. Okay, so as you can see along here, it showed you some masking that's occurring even after the EQ. Certain masking is okay, but when you're getting a lot of masking happening, you'll start to realize some instruments disappear because of that masking that's going on. So like I said, a certain amount of masking is fine, and that's how I left it, so it sounded fine. The mix entirely sounds quite clear. There's not a lot of, I guess, distortion or anything like that going on. But these are the two EQ moves that I used for the main parts of the instrumental parts in this track. There are other parts of the track. For example, I've got an organ, which I'll just close these off now so you guys don't have to worry about that. So I've got an organ here, a bass, which I'll play it with the bass as well. Okay, so if I show you the EQ on the bass, that's not the EQ on the bass, that's actually a imager. So I'll show you that in another video. So this EQ on the bass, very minimal stuff. So I removed out some of the low end stuff again, 25.7, and then some of the top end stuff at 16 kilohertz. So that's all I did with the bass. Now, some stuff with the bass, I mean, sometimes you might want to get rid of the 500 kind of area. Sometimes you might want to get rid of some of the 4K, some of that area there. But really, for the most part, the instrument sits within this area. The bass can sit within all of this part if it needs to. It depends on how many instruments you have in your mix, really, to be honest. But in this mix, it's fairly simple and plain, so I didn't have to remove a whole lot of stuff out. So doing just this minimal EQ, the bass sat really well within the mix, and it gave me the sound that I was after. So the next thing was this organ here, which, as you can see, there's nothing on this organ. And for a reason, because the organ didn't really need to. I wanted to have some of that low end stuff that I had with the organ, and I wanted some of the high end stuff. So if I just find a sectional organ here, this part here, I'll just play that to you now. So it's just a rolling kind of up the keyboard sort of thing there, and I put a bit of delay on it, but apart from that, I mean, there's nothing else happening. That, by the way, the instrument's just within Studio One. If you type in organ, it's the rock organ there. So you guys can see that. By the way, the instrument, like I said, for the drums, I showed you that earlier, that's a contact instrument. And the guitar, that's an actual sample that I found, and I used that sample to create this track. And the piano that I've got here is the Gentleman piano, so if you want to see that, that's what that is. And the next part here is just a standard track that I created. It's got no instrument on it. All it's doing is feeding some of the actual sounds, because when you're using Console Shaper, you can actually use crosstalk. So what I did was I set up crosstalk on a fairly decent high setting. Actually, I'll show you what I did. It's on the classic Studio Console setup. So this is the classic settings. And because there's crosstalk, what I did to create some extra noise and reverb within the track, I set up, this is not EQ related anyway, but thought I'd show you. So I set up a limiter, and I set up a reverb, and I pushed some of the signal into this, which was the crosstalk signal, and I put a reverb on it, so it created reverb in the track. So without having to create a bus, I've created a reverb bus, and that's using the crosstalk that's coming from the rest of these tracks. So it creates a real nice warmth to the track, and it's kind of like a little cheat that you could do, just so you know. And this limiter is just creating extra volume on that track, so I don't have to push this any further up. It's at 0 unity. The next EQ, as I said here on the piano, was basically some of that low end stuff removed, some of the mid sort of stuff, so I got rid of that. That band setting, it's at 1.4 kilohertz. The next one down is at 16, so this top frequencies there, got rid of some of that stuff. And then the next one here, which is color coded, is at 500. I removed minus 0.8 out of that instrument there. So that kind of sits it all right in the mix, and then you finally end up with this. Now, the key thing is, though, when I look at my mixes, I really try to keep it at -3 as the peak level. For, in general, prior to my master or anything like that, if at the best of things you can keep it at -6 prior to a master, that's perfect, because it gives you a lot more headroom to mess around with mastering and things like that, and especially when you're going to put other compressors and things like that on the master channel. I've only got 2 compressors happening in this entire mix, apart from the compressors on the actual instruments, which I can show you in another video. But this is more or less one compressor I've got on there. I'll show you that later on. And then I've got this EQ, imager, and maximizer there. But the other compressor there is obviously the solid bus, which is on my drums, and a tape. Oh, actually, I'll show you the compressor. So I've got the VC76, which is Native Instruments compressor. That's emulating the 76, which is like I guess it could have been the UAD 1176 or other 76 compressor similar to that. And then I've got some tape going on here. That's another plugin. But I mean, more or less, this tutorial is about showing you the EQs. So hopefully you guys can kind of understand from watching what I've done with this and the EQ that I used on it, that, you know, some EQ is good. Sometimes a lot of EQ is good, but really what it comes down to is making your instruments sit within the mix and making them sit together. And the way you find that is just by listening to them very carefully. And I usually listen at very quiet volumes, and I kind of then level match everything. I level everything before I put any EQ on it. But then once I've got them all kind of leveled at the right levels, then I'll start to introduce EQ if it's required. But sometimes it's just not required. Sometimes you just don't need EQ on some instruments. And as you saw on the organ, I had nothing. Like it didn't need it. I needed the organ to fill out the rest of the low end of the track, because I had taken out some of the low end of other instruments so they could sit in there and be in their own space or spectral space. So you guys, if you have any questions, hit me in the comments. I'm happy to answer any questions you've got about the EQ on this track or EQ on your tracks. Otherwise, I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope it didn't go too long and rambling on and stuff like that. But remember to like and subscribe, and also just keep coming back for this channel, because I keep bringing more and more good content out so you guys can learn from this. So otherwise, let you guys go, and peace.